The premier event for infection prevention and control is coming to San Antonio this June. APIC's annual conference brings you the latest research, innovative products, and practical knowledge to help you prevent infection. From inspiring keynotes to thought-provoking panel discussions, APIC 24 curates an extraordinary platform for knowledge exchange. Meet IPs from around the world who face the same daily challenges as you. If you work in infection prevention and control, you don't want to miss this event. Learn more and register to join us in person or virtually at annual.apic.org.
You're listening to the 5-Second Rule, brought to you by APIC, the Association for Professionals in Infection Control and Epidemiology. Together with our nearly 16,000 members, we strive to create a safer world through the prevention of infection. Join us while we talk to infection preventionists and other experts to learn the truth about some common myths related to the risk of infection and to get tips to keep yourself and the people around you safe from infection.
Hello, and welcome to the 5-Second Rule podcast. I'm Marie Wilson, infection preventionist and vice chair for APIC's Communications Committee. Over the next few months, you'll be hearing from myself and other members of our committee as we look for a new host to take over for Sylvia Covedo, who recently transitioned to a new role. We're really going to miss Sylvia as our host, but we're excited about this opportunity to reflect on where we've been and where we're going because the future is infection prevention. On today's episode, we'll dive into many infection preventionists' favorite activity, surveillance, specifically utilizing the National Healthcare Safety Network, or NHSN's, surveillance case studies. And returning to the podcast for today's discussion is a crowd and personal favorite, Marc-Oliver Wright. Marc is the clinical science liaison for the Central Region at PDI and has an extensive work and volunteer history in infection prevention, including as an infection preventionist at the University of Wisconsin, University Hospital in Madison, Wisconsin, and is the corporate director of infection control and quality improvement for the NorthShore University HealthSystem in Evanston, Illinois. His educational background includes a Bachelor of Sciences in Clinical Laboratory Sciences, a Master's of Science in Epidemiology, and advanced training in public health informatics, all from the University of Illinois, Chicago. Marc, welcome to the show, my friend.
Oh, thank you. I'm so happy to be back, and I'm excited about our topic today.
Yeah, so am I. Yeah, I might have taken a liberty there with presuming surveillance is everyone's favorite activity. Maybe it's just mine. But why don't we dive right in? As you and I both know, NHSN training is a key first step to becoming a competent infection preventionist. But we also recognize that it takes continued practice and learning to maintain that competency. So before we go too much further, Marc, would you mind kicking off our discussion with helping bring us all onto the same page? What is surveillance for the purpose of today's discussion?
Sure. So surveillance at its core is, it's the ongoing systematic collection, analysis, interpretation, and dissemination of data regarding a health-related event. That's your standard epidemiology 101 textbook definition. But what that actually means for IPs is using standardized, consistent definitions to identify and quantify healthcare-associated infections in their setting in order to calculate rates of infection and then benchmark those rates with historical baselines and regional or national averages. Surveillance acts as sort of a roadmap on the quality improvement journey, letting you know where you are and where you need to get to. In order to do this, the critical piece in all this really is standardized surveillance definitions, the rules of the road, if you will, what determines whether an event is or is not an HAI. If everyone is accurately, consistently, and equally applying the same set of rules, you can make comparisons not just over time, but from one facility or healthcare setting to another. And Conversely, if you're not doing so, your methods might be flawed, and any such comparisons can be flawed. In the U.S. and throughout other parts of the world, most of us use the definitions developed by the National Healthcare Safety Network, or NHSN. And in the U.S., we have reporting requirements through CMS and the inpatient prospective payment system that effectively mandates sort of many of our facilities to perform specific surveillance activities with reimbursement implications based on performance of our organizations. And importantly, multiple reports over the past 2 decades have quantified that proportion of time that IPs spend doing surveillance, and it consistently is the most time-intense and demanding aspect of the job.
It's the most time intensive, sure, but I would also add it's one of the very valuable parts of our work, specifically they try their best objective definitions from the NHSN.
Right.
I think that's a very unique quality that I've found of infection prevention work compared to other nationally reported metrics. Sometimes they're not quite as objective as NHSN has given us with those definitions that they have, which are such a value. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would totally agree. I mean, and a lot of the health metrics that we talk about in this country are very cut and dry, black and white. If you're looking at vitality statistics, you're either dead or alive. With HAI surveillance, there's more shades of gray involved, right? Because it really goes to documentation and how every patient is different. Every scenario is different. And that actually is both a blessing and a curse because it makes it the task of doing surveillance all that more challenging.
Yeah. And so I guess I'd like to take this opportunity. I feel it's a natural time, right, to distinguish between a clinical case definition of an infection versus a surveillance definition, which is really where infection preventionists spend our time in surveillance.
Yeah, and they both serve their own purpose, right? So a clinical definition of an infection, that's used to drive decision-making around patient care. Does this patient need an antibiotic or an antiviral, or do they not? And you can have results that are seemingly clinically relevant, but later determined to be the result of contamination. Whereas from a surveillance standpoint, it really is about standardization. The roots of a surveillance definition are grounded in common clinical manifestation and features, but the intent here is to set those rules of the road so that everyone can follow the same rules and so that you can get good, high, consistent data for comparative purposes.
Yeah, one thing comes to mind that a mentor told me once upon a time was the surveillance definitions are the line in the sand that had to get drawn. And sometimes there's going to be patients from a clinical perspective that fall on one side or the other of that line. And it can be frustrating when you're looking at a patient, you're going, I know they have an infection, but they don't meet definition, or vice versa, right? I know they don't actually have an infection. This is colonization, or, they've got the organism in them, but it's not making them sick. And so the line had to be drawn somewhere. And I think that NHSN does a lot to make sure that those are valid, and applicable across many settings. They do a lot of work there.
And they have to change and evolve as our technology evolves and changes. So if you look at something like MALDI-TOF, identifying, all sorts of, new organisms that even if you have a microbiology background, you have to stop and think, wait, what is that? Taking that information and updating, the categories of these organisms fit into, in light of, that new available technology. This is not a stagnant issue, but you want to make those incremental changes, in a timely manner, but you also want to be careful about it, because the more you change the surveillance definitions, the more you're not going to be able to compare this year's rates to last year's rates, right?
Yeah, definitely. So getting us towards our topic of discussions, the case studies, we've got as you're becoming an infection preventionist that's performing these healthcare associated infection surveillance activities, the first step is the NHSN training. You go through all of the modules that they have for the patient safety component. You do your attestation so that if you're going to get access to the reporting platform, SANS network, you can. you get your card, all these sorts of things. And so now you're set. So where do the case studies come into this portion of surveillance?
Well, this is a great question. Like any task or any profession, surveillance is a competency that IPs need to develop. And while the NHSN surveillance manual is out there for anyone to read, and you already mentioned the online trainings, competency, like quality, is a journey and not a destination. And as I alluded to earlier, every patient situation is different. So the AJIC NHSN case studies are a series of hypothetical patient vignettes or scenarios with details like any IP would encounter in a medical chart record review, coupled with a handful of multiple choice questions asking the reader or participant to apply the NHSN surveillance definitions accurately. And the case studies are actually open source in AJIC. And what that means is whether you have a subscription via your APIC membership or not, anyone can access them. And then with each case study, there's actually a hyperlink to the questions where after an IP reads through the case scenario, they can go in there, enter their responses to the questions that they are provided with. And then they're given not only the correct answers or the sort of answers to the quiz, but a detailed rationale for the correct response, complete with citations from the current NHSN surveillance manual.
Okay, so I don't want to skip over that last part too much. It's the importance of rationales. Oh man, even if you get the response right, this is kind of the show your math. You might have gotten to the right answer, but did you get there in the right way? And so I would really recommend even the most experienced IP, always read the rationale, because like you were mentioning, there's going to be minute detail updates that are sometimes very highly publicized and sometimes really not. And sometimes you can catch those updates in the rationales. And so kind of add value if you're not just the new IP, but the experienced IP using these case studies for their continued competency. Yeah. Maybe let's back up.
Totally.
I want to know, where did the AJIC NHSN case studies come from? Where does your interest in these spur out of?
Yeah. So the idea for doing this actually came up when I was an IP in my first decade of the profession. After a few years of doing surveillance, you get this sense that you know, or you think you know what you're doing. And at the time, I was discussing with a more experienced colleague a particularly frustrating central line associated bloodstream or CLABSI case. In this case, it was mutually agreed between all manner of clinicians caring for the patient, including the ID service, that the lab report had actually been a contaminant, but because it was caused by a pathogen, in this case, I think it was Enterococcus, it actually met the surveillance definition. And this scenario is common, where clinical and surveillance definitions, are again different for good reason, like we talked about. I was lamenting calling this case. And the IP I was discussing it with from another facility pointedly stated that she does not and would not report that case to NHSN, nor include it in their in-house data as an HAI. And it occurred to me right then and there that even well-experienced IPs may be making mistakes or errors, either intentionally or unintentionally, in their surveillance. So I approached a mentor of mine, Joan Hebden, and two staff members at NHSN, and they were Teresa Horan and Kathy Ellen Britson, with the idea of developing these case studies. And coincidentally, at the same time, I was a recent addition to the AJIC editorial board, and I asked Dr. Larson if AJIC would be interested in publishing these, and it all kind of came together. And we've been, doing these for the past dozen years or so.
Well, so obviously it's a podcast. You guys can't see my face, but I'm grimacing through that story. It's so familiar, right? You have the case you don't want to call. Yeah. You talk to a colleague. There's deviation in how it would be managed through public reporting, and so that it totally makes sense. Where did these come from? Consistency across the board. Everyone getting on the same playing field. Totally. Well, I am grateful for your concerns. I won't say frustration. I didn't hear that. I won't put that word in your mouth. But that's maybe how I might feel. And because these things are just so valuable. How long have they been around?
So they started coming out in 2010, which seems not that long ago, but and at the same time, forever ago.
Okay,
Yeah.
hold on. I'd just like to say, because like this is I feel like such a universal experience. Like there's probably a new IP, I hope, listening to the session today, and they're like, oh my gosh, people are still having these issues 12 years later. Like, yes, this is exactly something I experienced last week. And so it's, we try to make this podcast evergreen, and here we go. This is very evergreen or everlasting. Wow. Okay. So over a decade of case studies. Where do the ideas of the case studies come from? How do you get those patient examples?
I love this question. So this has actually evolved over time, but I would say for more than half of the tenure for this, there have been two of the most predominant sources are whenever the surveillance definitions are revised, we actually try to develop a case study specifically around those changes. And the idea being here that you get the notification, you have new training materials that are afforded to you, but maybe you missed the memo. And we want to make sure that the nuances or any changes that have been modified to that surveillance manual are emphasized in the case study. But those changes, like I mentioned, thankfully are few and far between. And it's really the second source that is even more fun. And namely, it's that IPs who are doing surveillance for NHSN currently have a mechanism to ask questions and seek clarification. We all know this. It's the NHSN help desk. When you send your questions or scenarios to the help desk, a subject matter expert at NHSN reviews your questions and your scenario and responds within usually in very short order. But you can imagine if you're on the receiving end of these emailed questions, let's say you're the CLABSI subject matter expert at NHSN. So all the CLABSI module related questions, scenarios, concerns that are coming in from IPs across the country, they all come to you. So if you're on the receiving end, you might, in fact you do, over time detect a pattern. And if you're getting the same or related questions or scenarios, that suggests that there's an opportunity for clarification or education. And we use the case studies as one of those tools for that clarification.
Okay, lots that's exciting there. Things, ideas. Okay, so we've got the changes. So this kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about make sure you read the rationale. Little changes, we develop case studies. So a question that came to mind on that was, are these different than the case studies that they present at that annual education training that happens about March or so each year?
That's a great question. So I would say that the same people that help write these case studies for the AJIC NHSN case studies are the same people who are developing that content for that spring session. So often, and I don't want to speak on behalf of NHSN because I don't work for them, but you've got the same subject matter experts that are working together to develop both of those learning opportunities, right? So when we look at how does a case study get developed, well, we have the work group between Ms. Hebden, myself, and the staff at NHSN, and we meet monthly or bi-monthly, and we identify where those opportunities are and sort of plan out, here's the next case study we should be working on. And then usually 1 to 2 lead authors, often the subject matter expert at NHSN takes the lead in drafting a scenario, quiz questions, and the rationale, explaining that correct response. And also worth mentioning, the introduction to these case studies, if you've not read them or not read them recently, they specifically tell you which chapters in the user manual should be utilized. It's sort of like the ultimate open book test. Then that draft of that case study is circulated to members of the larger committee who review and provide edits and suggestions, clarifications. And once we're satisfied with it, it gets passed through clearance at CDC. And lastly, the case study with the questions and the hyperlink to the quiz, which after completion, again, provides you with the answers and the rationale, all get submitted to AJIC, which in turn also sends it out for its review process and publishes them as open access as space in the journals made available. And I think it's important to recognize that these case studies are in fact thoroughly vetted by the same subject matter experts who maintain and periodically revise the NHSN surveillance definitions. And like I said earlier, they help answer your help desk questions. They are authentic and validated and direct from the original source.
Okay, so I'm hearing that there might be similarities between the case studies presented in the AJIC journal, but then also in the trainings, but not the exact same. Definitely, it sounds like maybe we've got this nuance change. We really want you guys to be able to implement into your practice. So let's practice actually identifying it and using the definitions. So the other thing that's really exciting to me there is that my emails to NHSN at cdc.gov are not going into a void when I get my response. And so that is, I love, IPs are always looking for patterns, as you said. So can you tell me a little bit more about the value in sending those messages and how they inform things like the case studies?
Yeah. So, the interesting thing here is that, well, it's actually, there's two things worth mentioning. Is first of all, you have the NHSN Help Desk, which that's the only way that you can be confident and sure, especially with a complex case, that you're using the surveillance definitions appropriately, right? It informs the subject matter expert where there might be sources of confusion. And then when we do these case studies, like I said, you go and you enter your answers and you get your, the correct answers and the rationale. But we, on the work group, we actually get the responses and the rate of response and, what percent are, correct. While the responses themselves to these case studies are anonymous, the participation sort of acts as a feedback loop for NHSN themselves. When we review the responses, when a question or a case itself has a poor pass or a success rate, it actually informs the same team at NHSN that there may be a lack of clarity in the surveillance definition or a need for additional training or information. So as you can see, these case studies serve more than just one purpose of improving IP competency.
Yes. Okay. And so I want to put a plug out there for anybody that finds themselves, like, we go back to your original, like, how did these develop? There was differences between me and a trusted colleague. There are going to be times that there's differences, and it's okay to have that communication with NHSN. That's what they're there for. It sounds like, as Marc was saying, it's a very valuable feedback loop for them, to learn where can we add in additional information and training or support for other infection preventionists that maybe don't have the time to ask these questions or don't feel comfortable asking these questions. The other thing is too, and this is just my own personal experience, if there's ever been a time that you're calling an infection, you get pushback from the internal players, the key stakeholders at your organization that have oversight with you in this external reporting. This is a great way to kind of leverage NHSN support and saying, no, your IP is right. Even if you think you're right, it's a great resource there, not only to give them feedback, but then also to give yourself that added support, especially if you're a lone IP. APIC is a wonderful organization to get engaged with, so you don't feel as alone. So you can get that support from peers, but that NHSN Help Desk is a really valuable resource beyond the case study development. So I just want to put that out there for anyone that's looking for help. Or you might learn something new, right? Maybe you learn something new, and so that's an opportunity too. But really great resources that you've touched on there, Marc, and I'm excited. So, how you mentioned a little bit how the information from the help desk is used. Is there any information, any feedback loop associated with the case study specifically? And if so, how is that information?
You mean the responses that we get submitted?
Yeah.
So we I think I touched on this a little bit, maybe not quite as well as I should have. We review every case study participation, not just in terms of how many people are participating, but what kind of answers are being submitted to the individual questions. And obviously it's always good when you see a question and you get a 100% correct. I can tell you that those are few and far between. But more importantly, if we're reviewing the responses and we see that there's a particular case study that has a less than acceptable pass level, it gives us pause to consider, is it how the case study itself was worded or how the question was worded, or is this really an opportunity where, people are still confused on the matter? And, we return to a lot of the same themes. So I can tell you, repeat infection timeframes. That is something that we emphasize a lot because It's easy to make a mistake. I think probably the most rewarding thing about having worked on this for as long as I have is that even it doesn't matter how long you've been doing surveillance. When I go to draft and participate in these case studies, there'll be opportunities where I'll be, writing what I think is a good case study and a good question and a good answer. And my subject matter expert comes back to me and says, "Actually, Marc, that's not correct." So it kind of goes to you're never too experienced to learn something new. And I think sort of being open to this, if surveillance was easy, if surveillance was formulaic, first of all, anyone could do it. Second of all, you could probably program a machine to do it entirely. And that's simply not the case. And I wish it was. I mean, my first love was surveillance technology and informatics, and I thought that computers were going to solve the world's problems, for at least for IP surveillance activities. But it just doesn't work out that way, for lack of a better way to put it.
I think that anyone working actively in infection prevention, especially with a large health system with resources for information technology for the system, we're being provided with these various tools to help make us more efficient. And part of that is electronic surveillance. And there's some that get us a lot closer and there's some that don't. And so we're a ways off still, I think, from that being a reality for common practice with infection preventionists, right? Because every program is different and the resources they're provided are different. So how can IPs or teams, right? Because the other thing I want to talk to here is this has been a lot of novice IP talk, but our experts also, our leaders, our system directors, our local directors, managers, how can the AJIC and NHSN case studies be leveraged within a team or an individual?
Yeah, so the obvious use of these is at the individual level. You get your copy of AJIC, you read through the case study, you go to the link, and you submit your responses. But I would argue that this can and perhaps often should be a group effort. If you utilize these at the department level as an IP manager or director, and you encourage your team to take the exam individually and discuss it afterwards, it can serve several purposes beyond individual competency enhancement. First, you reap the benefit of greater collective understanding, theoretically leading to greater inter-rater reliability. And secondly, and I did this myself previously, you can actually use these case studies as documented evidence of IP competency. At one time or another during an accreditation survey, one or more employees in an infection prevention department may be asked to provide their employee records to demonstrate competency in their position. A generally accepted demonstration may include civic board certification, but you might have new IPs who have not sat for their initial exam yet, or you might have surveyors who deem board certification as not a full demonstration of competency. And, while I might disagree with this last scenario, quarterly assessments of accurately applying surveillance definitions can actually be a useful adjunct. And if you're a solo practitioner, or even if you're not, another team effort can actually involve local APIC chapter meetings. Many chapters have developed CIC work groups to better help prepare their members for initial or recertification. And by presenting and discussing these case studies as a group, it lends itself to the same benefits as departmental level group work, with the adjunct of varying perspectives across multiple different organizations and health systems. It can be a really robust learning opportunity without requiring too much time.
Yeah, you just got to the one point that I was like, let's make sure we highlight that. And it's that these are already in a nice package for our leaders. And whether that's at a local chapter or a health system or a department, you've got the scenario, the answers, and the rationales. You've got the tools. Just it can be hard to find that time, right, to be able to walk everyone through it. But a fun lunch and learn is one way that I have seen it used. And what's nice too is there's always some team building that happens to. Oh, yeah, I remember a case we had something like this similar, And so and I don't know, COVID is still so important in prevention of COVID, and now monkeypox and these sorts of things are popping up that there's a lot to distract us. And so this is a way for us to stay engaged in the conversation of NHSN reporting and maintain competency, even if you're not the one on your team that's responsible for that specific surveillance activity, right? So I know within my health system, I'm currently on Lab ID CDIF, which is, it's a relatively plug and jug type of definition, but I'm also on CAUTI surveillance. So with bloodstream infections and, hold on, let me back up. CAUTI, catheter-associated UTIs. If there's anyone that's not an IP still listening, sorry about that. But also, way to go. Maybe you want to become an IP if you're still interested. Okay, anyways. And so the bloodstream infections are something that I'm not looking at even on a monthly basis, except for in the review meetings. And so that's a really good way to kind of get everybody back on the same competency level, so that if there's coverage that needs to occur between colleagues, that can be done a bit more proficiently. Well, let's see sorry. Where can an infection preventionist find these, Mark? It's been a while, so where can I go?
So they are published in AJIC, and this is something that in recent conversations we've become aware of, that they're not always the easiest things to find in AJIC, because they're sort of put in the print version or the monthly issues as white spaces available. White space is just a fancy way of saying, hey, I've got 42 pages of articles, but we always put out 44 pages. Oh, we've got 2 extra pages that we don't have advertisements for. Let's pop in a case study. But I think, like a lot of people, I'm not necessarily opening or reading my print copy of AJIC. I'm going online. And so as these are made available, they're also listed in the table of contents there. But what I've come to realize is we need to keyword those up a little bit on the Elsevier side. So I'm going to be reaching out to our colleagues at Elsevier to see if we can come up with some keywords to make it easier to search for them in group. What I would add to this is that the case studies are current as of the time that they are released or put out. So I mentioned that we started this in 2010, and you can, if you go back in the archives, probably find a 2010 NHSN AJIC case study, and you can read it and you can take it, or you can at least try to answer the questions. But the problem is that between 2010 and 2022, some things may have changed. And the answers or the questions may not accurately reflect the current NHSN surveillance manual. So I would encourage people to try and stay relatively contemporaneous with this, realizing that everyone's pulled in multiple directions, or especially over the last couple of years, but that you want to stick to the more recent case studies whenever possible, just to make sure that the information you're getting is current and active. We do disable those case studies in terms of the link where you are able to retrieve your rationale. It doesn't get rid of your paper copy version, but if you go to the link and it's no longer a case study that accurately reflects the current definitions, we try to retire those as appropriate. So there will be information available, if I'm remembering correctly, on the 5-second rule podcast, the webpage, where we'll be sending you to both the AJIC website and the NHSN webpage.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. Okay. So that's another really good point there. I'm going to highlight again for everybody, is that unless you're just a historian extraordinaire and you like the games of pulling out your 2010 surveillance definitions and sitting there and doing the 2010 surveillance, probably don't do that. Maybe that's your hobby, and that's totally fine. Hobbies are important. But if you're looking at it from a team building or personal competency building exercise, it is probably best to stick with what is most recently released through the AJIC website. If it has an active link for responses, that's your indicator that it is still valid. So I guess the other thing is, if you find an error and it was published in 2010, you think you found an error. Let me say this. If you think you found an error and it was published in 2010, maybe stop before you email NHSN because it's out of date. But the recent ones are not. And the vetting process that you described, Mark, was just really incredible. So with the case studies, I think one of the last questions I've got for us here is, how does this fit, in your perspective, into the larger context of the infection preventionist competency development?
Yeah, this is a great question. So the first thing I'd say that, if you think about something, if you think about your day in and day out tasks, and this repeatedly comes up as taking up 50% or more of IP's time, surveillance definitions can and do change over time, and none of us are immune from cognitive biases or logical fallacies. And our job responsibilities and where our career takes us also can and do change. And lastly, these case studies, the reading, answering, or reviewing is not a huge time commitment. You're usually talking about 15 minutes or so if you're doing these independently or as a solo practitioner or solo person taking the case studies. They average coming out about once a year. In the context of broader IP competency development, I guess I would say that every minute you invest in yourself, in your competency development, your professional development, reaps its own rewards over time. This is a core job function for the vast majority of infection preventionists. And whether your surveillance activities are compartmentalized or broad, maintaining that awareness, that competency of how do I utilize the surveillance manual and the information in front of me to make an accurate determination for the event that I'm looking at is such a core function of our job that the more you invest in yourself, the easier it will pay over time for you.
Yeah, no, to add on to that, the thing about that practice of using these objective case definitions and understanding the rationale behind the development of them, it can influence or inform other aspects of the practice as an infection preventionist. So say you're looking at a very specific infection that's of importance to your organization, but is not necessarily publicly reported, or there is not an NHSN case definition. You can, by learning and becoming very proficient with those principles, there's a way to scientifically extract that into these other scenarios. So the example that, originally comes to mind was about 2.5 years ago now. A lot of infection preventionists were looking around at each other and going, how do I know if this is a COVID infection related to my healthcare organization or related to the community? There's a lot of unknowns at that time. We now have a definition for hospital onset COVID. But prior to that time, being able to use the principles of either a lab identified approach or a more less lab-based, more symptom-based approach, like with our pneumonia infections or something like that, being able to use that data was really helpful. Does it allow for external comparison? No, not necessarily, but it does allow for tracking and trending within the organization, as long as the rules are applied and the case definition is made and applied the same way every time. So, I would add that as an important part of these case studies and practicing with the NHSN definition. I guess the other thing that I would add about, even if you're not actively one of the team that performs NHSN surveillance, you never know what will change. You never know how restructuring or job opportunities or these sorts of things will change. And so maintaining that competency along with the other activities of IP living, if you will, is so important.
Competency is like muscles for the brain. The more you exercise it, the stronger it gets. And if you let it atrophy, it's really hard to bounce back from, right? Even if you're not regularly doing surveillance, if you're practicing, a competency assessment, or even through these, small vignettes, it keeps you fresh. It keeps you critically thinking. My current surveillance responsibilities are, to put it politely, minimal. But I think it's absolutely an essential skill set that I don't want to lose. So, while I enjoy working on these, I almost as much enjoy taking the initial drafts and seeing if I still know what I'm doing.
Well, it's a shared language between us all, right? It connects us.
Absolutely.
Definitely. Marc, do you have any last minute thoughts or details that you want to share with us about the case studies? Or
I would say there's a couple of things. Over the last 6 months or so, I'm out in the field quite a bit, going from one hospital to another, and I get to meet infection preventionists, and it's I don't want to say it's shocking, but it's certainly surprising to me the number of new infection preventionists that I've seen, and I would define anyone that's an infection preventionist in their tenure of, say, 3 years or less as new. And it's not because they're not good at what they're doing. They're excellent at what they're doing. But what they've been doing for the vast majority of that time has been COVID mitigation. So if you've been, dedicating your time to that, how much time, exposure, and competency development have you been able to glean for surveillance? Because while we're, still enjoying COVID and we are having fun talking about monkeypox as of late, surveillance is always going to be a core practice. So if you are new to infection prevention, first of all, my hat is off to you. What a time to enter this field and this profession. But I'm hoping that if you've not had an opportunity, you've not been exposed to these NHSN case studies, that when time allows, that you remember this podcast and say, you know what, I need to look those up. Because surveillance is for the foreseeable future going to remain a core competency in this profession. And this is a free, fully vetted, wonderful toolkit or resource for you as you begin your journey as in the field of infection prevention. And I again deeply tip my hat to anyone who was brave enough to come in the last 2-3 years.
It's a great time to be an infection preventionist. It really is. It's been a hard time, but without pressure, something about diamonds. Okay. Well, Marc, thank you so much. It has really been a pleasure getting to speak with you about something I think we're both pretty passionate about. I know I've had a lot of fun, and I'm excited to get back into the case studies to improve my personal practice. If you're listening and you want to know more about today's discussion, there's a list of resources on the webpage for this episode. Visit 5secondrule.org. That's numeral 5 secondruleshow.org. As mentioned at the top of the episode, the APIC Communications Committee is proud to contribute to this podcast, and we'd like to hear from our listeners. Please rate or review us wherever you listen to this podcast. If you have something you want us to highlight in the future episodes, email us at 5secondrule@apic.org. That's numeral 5 second, secondrule @apic.org. We're so appreciative to the hard work each and every infection preventionist is doing to make a safer world through infection prevention. Thank you for listening. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to the 5-Second Rule, produced by the Association for Professionals in Infection Control and Epidemiology staff and the APIC Communications Committee, in partnership with Human Factor. Audio tech is Blake Alphen.